Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Pandemic Interview Series. Today I've got the opportunity to talk to Maestro Acosta-Martinez. Maestro is a traditional master of arms. She teaches classical and historical fencing at the Martinez Academy of Arms in New York. So thanks a lot for sitting down with me. It's always a pleasure to get to see you.
Yeah, for me too.
Now I'd like to just go right into this. You've been fencing for a long time, but have you done other martial arts as well?
I did a little bit of Wu Style Tai Chi and some Qi Kong, but very little. I don't feel like I really studied it. I mean, I did for about a year, but I don't really feel like I studied it.
You were introduced to it,
Yes,
as it were. So almost your primary experience is in Western martial arts.
Yes, I have taken some combatives with James Noriega, some Namaha with him. I have done a teeny little bit of other things, you know, just trying them. But yeah, primarily it's just it's the fencing that
Cool.
interests me the most and that I like to do. Mm-hmm.
When did you start fencing?
Oh, it's been about 37 years that I've been fencing. While. Yeah. I started fencing mostly because I used to go to the antique shows at Sotheby's. Well, not shows really, they're sales at Sotheby's and Christie's for my other interest, which was my primary job, which was antique restoration. And so when we would go to look at furniture to evaluate or to give estimates for clients, I would often see that there were sales on antique arms and armor, and that always interested me. And so I would look at the swords, and then finally I decided, you know, these things are awesome. I'd like to start to collect them, but I don't know anything about its use. So I looked up in the phone book. I don't even know if phone books exist anymore. But I looked up in the phone book fencing schools, and I found Maestro Rhodes and 2 other schools. But his school was located about 7 blocks from where I worked. So he's the first one I went to. And then when I went there, I decided, no, this is the place. This is where I want to be. And so I never went to the other schools.
Very cool. I was going to ask how you found a master to study with. And so for those of you that don't know, a phone book is this thing of paper that's pre-Google.
Oh, yeah.
Also good for hitting people with. But we'll leave that to another time.
Yeah, for another one, yeah.
So you've been fencing for about 37 years. How long have you been teaching?
I think I've been teaching for about 20 years.
Okay.
It seems like forever, but I think it's about 20 years.
Yeah, it does sometimes. What do you teach at the school?
What do I teach? Well, yeah. I teach all the weapons that we do. What we do is, since there's three of us there, what we do is we rotate. And so every 4 months or so, we change what we're teaching. So sometimes I'm teaching, teaching rapier. Sometimes I'm teaching small sword. Sometimes I'm teaching foil. So we go through these cycles where one of us is teaching. So I'll be doing maybe I'll be doing rapier and small sword, and Jared will be doing saber, and maybe Ramon is doing Italian foil and French foil. It's different every class. Okay. But we do go through cycles like that, so that we So eventually we're teaching everything that we teach. It's just at different times.
So I can see how that'd be a benefit because you're able to rotate through them and you never burn out on any one thing because you're doing other things, which is very cool.
Yeah, it is good for us, but it's also good for the students because the students they're getting the same material, but they're getting a different teacher. So sometimes they get these moments where all of a sudden something clicks for them. And it's not that we're teaching them something different. It's just that they're hearing it differently from somebody else, which is an interesting phenomenon. But it happens, and so that's why we like to rotate. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a good idea. It's I like to tell people at my school that the hardest thing about teaching is finding the right words for different individuals. And
well, yeah, they learn differently too. I mean, some are more visual. Some, they hear it. Some like they hear it, but they don't really understand it until they see it. And then some will see it, but unless you explain it to them, they don't.
Yeah,
it doesn't register. So, yeah.
What do you find the most fulfilling about teaching?
I think it's an interesting question because I think there's a lot of things I like about teaching. I guess what is most fulfilling is that there's this continuation of tradition, and I feel like I am being a part of that tradition and being able to impart that and see the students grow and develop and become fencers in their own right. I think it makes me feel like I'm connected to the world and history in a way that I don't think that I don't feel like in other things. Like, that I also restore antiques. Well, I feel in a way that when I'm restoring something, that I'm preserving it for the future. That I am bringing it back to life when it's really been messed up over the years, and that I'm bringing it back to what it looked like originally, or conserving something so that it has so you can see the age, you can see what it's gone through, depending on what the owner wants. But at the end, I feel that I've preserved this one thing. Whereas with fencing, I feel like I'm preserving a larger thing, which is this tradition. And so that is probably what I like the most about the teaching.
Yeah, it's a fascinating thing to be able to connect now to then, and then bring them together. Now, you mentioned when you were talking about the different things that you teach there at the school, foil and small sword. What's the difference between foil and small sword? I mean, I know the weapons, but also the styles.
Okay, well, foil, we retain the concept that foil is a tool, and foil is the tool that we use to learn fencing. In the 19th century, that idea changes. So in the latter half of the 19th century, foil sort of becomes an entity unto its own, and I believe that's how most people see it today. We still look at foil as a tool. It's a training tool, and so we're learning fencing using this training tool. The difference in what we do in foil and what we do in small sword is that in the small sword, we are looking at it in the context of how it was taught. So we're looking at it from the perspective of it's a weapon that we can use in a duel. It's a weapon that we can use to defend ourselves on the street. It's a weapon that has its own salutes. It has its own historical context. So when we teach small sword, even though it was originally taught in the 18th century with foils, we find it, because we also teach foil as it was taught in the 19th century classically, we find that we use a different tool to separate it in context for the students. So this way, because they also do a different salute, it's a different way of separating it, so that in their bodies and in the way they look at it, they can separate the two. Primarily, the difference in how we look at the two systems is that small sword, we emphasize opposition. With foil, we emphasize redirection, which is our concept, which means that we are using less opposition when we do foil.
Cool, cool. Now, at the academy, you also do Italian and Spanish rapier. Mm-hmm. And how would you describe the difference between Italian and Spanish rapier?
Well, with the Spanish rapier, we are looking at a system that is circular in nature. And so when we are in motion, we are moving to create different angles to the adversary. And we're also looking at it from the context of the Spanish look at movement and break it down into movement. So when we teach it, we don't use all the Spanish terms because sometimes we use, when we're teaching small sword, sometimes we use a lot of French terms, but they know those terms also from foil.
Right.
So it's not a big leap. But then when we do the Spanish, it's kind of a big leap for them to have to then learn all the Spanish terminology. So we mostly teach it using English. But what we're looking at in the Spanish is we're looking at different movements. So the movements of the feet, the movements of the weapon, the movements of the body. So how we're teaching it is different than the Italian. With the Italian, we're looking at a linear system. So we're looking at a specific posture, a specific techniques, specific guards. Whereas when we are looking at the Spanish, we're really defining everything we do by looking at in terms of how we're moving in that circle, how we're moving in space in relationship to our adversary.
No, that's a great description. I like that. I'm not sure about this question, so I'm going to leave this one up to you. And I'll start it here.
Mm-hmm.
You have a reputation as a very scary person, yet you're one of the nicest people I've met. Have you found that this helps you when you're teaching, or does it make people nervous, or do you find it affects your interaction with newer or even experienced students?
I don't think it does at all in the school. I think when we teach outside of the school, sometimes people, and I think that people find me scary only because when I'm teaching, I'm very serious, because I believe this is a serious art, and I believe it deserves to be presented. It deserves to be presented in a way that means that it's, we're teaching essentially people how to kill other people.
Right.
And so, and when we're teaching them, we're also teaching them to be serious and mindful. And so I think that's why I come across that way, because I take it seriously. So with the students, I think once they start working with me, they accept that, and I think they actually appreciate that. But when we go outside and teach at other venues, like Combat Con or other places like that, I think people sometimes are taken aback because I am so serious, and I think that's why they think I'm scary. But
okay,
but I also find it amusing because because I always think, you know, I have this this kind of strange sense of humor. So sometimes I think it's just funny, and my sisters think it's hysterical. They always tease me about that students think that I'm scary.
I remember sitting next to you. I think it was at Combat Con, and there was a bunch of us at dinner, and I was sitting next to you, and I was poking you in the shoulder like you were my little sister, just to irritate you. And I could see people's eyes get wide. Like, what are you doing? Don't worry. But yeah, like I said, one of the nicest people I've met. Now, you've had the opportunity to work on several books as well as teaching. What books have you worked on, and which book did you find the most challenging to work on?
I don't think I've really worked on that many books. I helped Jared with a translation of Capo Ferro. That was probably the most challenging, only because we were limited. We were limited in time because the translation had been done by someone else, and it was horrible. And Jared had paid that person. And so Ramon and I helped him with, initially we started to try to fix it and realized we couldn't fix it and had to start from the beginning. And then we were limited by the fact that it was also supposed to be a literal translation. So that was very challenging because it was not something we had ever intended to do. The other book was the reprint of Domenico Angelo's book. And that I went through, and that was actually a pleasure because I went through and just pointed out the parts that needed to be explained for the modern reader, as people at that time would have understood. Then there was a few things that were just translated English in a way that made it more confusing. So I went back and looked at the French and clarified that. I am currently working on a book that I'm finding extremely interesting and challenging because it's a book on women fencers at the turn of the century.
Oh, fantastic.
And it's more about, it's less about the women, but more about how the perception of the culture at the time of women fencers. So it's very interesting, and the more I find it, the more complex it gets, and I'm trying to keep it light so that more people will read it.
One of my favorite stories, and I'm sure you know this one, is, I can't remember her name, but she used to enjoy dressing up as a man, going to parties and insulting women, and then getting into duels. Have you heard this story?
Yeah, that's Julie Maupin, and she was second half of the 17th century, beginning of the 18th century. She didn't really insult women, she insulted the men, which is
Okay.
because, and the men took offense to her because she also liked women. So there were, yeah, she purposely did things to annoy a lot of people.
Everybody has to have a hobby.
Yes. Yes.
You and Ramon have worked with Anthony DeLongis on some video projects for Spanish Rapier, Italian Rapier, French smallsword, right?
Yes.
Which of those did you enjoy doing the most for those introduction videos?
Well, I just assisted in the Spanish and the Italian. So I have to say the French because I was the primary teacher on the French one. I found it interesting because it's different working in front of a camera than it is teaching to a class.
Yeah.
But also I found it interesting because when you're trying to do a complete kind of overview of the school, it's difficult to know what to emphasize and what not to, and so it was kind of interesting just to go through the system and pick out what I thought was important elements to really stress. Although I try to cover as much as I could, there's certain things that I discussed a little bit more than others. So that was kind of challenging, but at the same time, enjoyable.
Yeah, it's definitely a different world to be in front of people versus where you have that personal interaction versus a camera.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which brings up an interesting thing that a lot of us are running into these days. Are you in the academy still teaching via video during the lockdown?
So we are doing some Zoom classes. It is challenging for sure, but we are doing these classes because we want to make sure that our students stay they stay connected in a way, and give them a way to stay also connected to each other. So we've been doing some classes, but just to our regular students. It's not open to the public because we don't really feel we can teach via Zoom.
Yeah.
So it's just going through elements that they already know, but reinforcing foundational elements, which is challenging because you don't get the same feedback, from the student watching them. So essentially, it's like you're doing it in front of a camera. So
right, yeah.
So that, and then we've also been doing these salons where we might get between 40 and 50 students listening while we talk about a subject, and then they're able to ask questions. And we do every Friday night. We do these salons with different topics, and they can set the topic, and we just talk.
Very cool. Very cool that you're doing that and finding a way to not just maintain the training, but the community, because that's an important part of it that I think often gets overlooked.
Yeah, absolutely.
I've had the pleasure to train with you several times. Well, the pleasure and sometimes the pain. I find that you've got a really fluid movement, and you're beautiful to watch in your fencing and to learn from. But with your teaching schedule, do you find that you still get the opportunity to fence and work on your fencing skills?
Not to the degree that I would like. Sometimes I will fence with Jared or with Ramon at the end of class, to be active. But other than that, we sometimes will do we'll pick a Sunday afternoon and have just free fencing for 2 or 3 hours. And then I will fence with whoever's there, and fence with Jared, fence with Ramon. We'll all fence to really, and when I'm doing that, I'm really pushing myself in different areas. Like sometimes I'm really fencing Italian to really push myself using a lot of, lower postures, using my legs more. So I do that, but at home, I think Ramon is always doing something, whether he's just working with, like he walks around with a foil in his hand or some weapon in his hand, working his hand, and then he's upstairs because we have an apartment upstairs that we use the living room like a training room. So he's upstairs working on the target. I will a little bit, but not as much as he does. Which is interesting because we always say, oh, I need a lesson, and sometimes he'll give me a lesson. But mostly we're so into the teaching that we often forget to train. And even now that we've been home, we've been working out, but he's doing more workout on the fencing target than I am.
Yeah, and That's one of the hard things I've found is making, not finding, but making the time for your continuing, or for my continuing education. Because like being a doctor, a fencer can never stop learning.
Right. You can't stop learning, but you also can't stop moving.
Right. Yeah.
You have to be active. That's an important. Whenever I'm teaching, I never sit down. I'm always moving, precisely for that reason. Because while I'm standing there watching them, sometimes as I'm watching the students, I'm also like balancing on one foot.
Yeah.
Or I'm doing something to be active as I'm watching. So yeah, you can't stop. And I definitely need to be, especially now, I definitely need to be doing more. So hopefully this week or next week, I'll start taking some lessons again.
Nice.
Because because then Ramon will push me, whereas if I'm just working on the target, I can get lazy.
Which brings up another question. And what do you find most challenging about teaching? And what do you find most rewarding about teaching?
I think it's the same thing. I think what's most challenging is how to reach a student, how to get them over plateaus, because sometimes they plateau and they don't seem to be getting better. And so that's always challenging, but what's the most rewarding is actually finding that way, whether it's moving them to a different weapon, or working with them on just that specific thing that's holding them back, or finding different ways to get them to progress. And so while that's challenging, it's also rewarding, when you see it works.
Yeah, that's a really good answer. Have you worked with dancers and transferring the fencing knowledge that you have and that you're imparting to them to dancers? And how does that transfer for you?
It's kind of interesting, because at the end of the day, I find that it's up to the individual. So we've had some dancers that are trained in ballet, and some of them are it's so much a part of them that they can't transition to what we're doing. And they can't transition to the idea that this is that the fencing is about hitting, and you have to accept that you're going to be hit. So it's kind of interesting. Then we have others that it sort of has helped them in what they do, because it gives them more confidence. And then we have others that we have one particular student that was a principal dancer at I think it was the New York City Ballet, and he was in a very bad accident and couldn't dance for a long time, and then was able to dance again, but then just recently retired. And he's taken to the fencing beautifully, because it's also I think it's also just a part of his nature that he's very he likes to be very physical. Yeah. And so the ballet training that he had has really helped him. Then we have a young girl who is also trained in ballet, and she's taking to it very well as well. So I think it's really more about the individual and less about the training, because what I find the most interesting is that a lot of students that come to us now are not as physical as, for example, as I was when I was a child. So As a child, I was outside from the age of 3, through till I was 18. Every summer, from like after breakfast, outside playing something, running, bicycling, playing football, volleyball, soccer, playing, army, whatever, building go-karts, running. We did that every day after school, every day during the summer. And so I was very physical. By the time I was in college, I was playing I played field hockey for the college team. And then when I came to fencing, it was very easy to do all the postures, to follow, what the Maestro Rhodes was teaching. But I find today that a lot of the students that come to us haven't had that physical upbringing. They don't know what their bodies are doing. They don't understand, if we tell them to bend their knees or give them a particular posture, 5 seconds later, they're in a different posture. And it's because they don't understand what their bodies are doing. That is probably the only thing that translates from the dancers that come to us, is that at least they understand what their bodies are doing.
Knowing where you are in space and how your body is connected, and one shift of your toe can affect things. And you'd mentioned a little bit earlier, and I wanted to actually touch on this because I want people to get to know the person I know in you. And what a lot of people don't know is that you also restore antique furniture, and you're a specialist in that. How did you get into working in restoration of antique furniture?
Well, quite by accident, actually. So in college, I was a painting major. And I realized when I was a senior and I did my senior show that a lot of what happens in the art world is very political. And so I decided while I loved painting and doing sculptures and all, I didn't like the political environment. And so I decided I have to find something else to do. So my great uncle was a cabinet maker in Ecuador, and I always enjoyed going to his shop. So I thought, let me learn about designing and building furniture. And so I went to, I found a few cabinet makers in upstate New York where I was living, and also traveled to a couple places in Massachusetts and Vermont. But what I found was that none of these cabinet makers would take me on as an apprentice, because they all would say to me, we don't need someone right now, or if we take you on as an apprentice, we're investing all this time in, and you're probably going to go off and get married and have kids and never do this job. And so I thought, wow, that's so interesting that they don't take me seriously in any way. And so I kept trying, going to different places. And one day, just quite by accident, I was working at the time selling hosiery in a department store, because I had to make a living. Yeah. And I saw this girl coming down the escalator, and it was someone I had studied with in college. And so she came over, and we were trying to catch up and talk. And she told me that she was actually living in New York City, working for an antique dealer. And I told her the problems I was having trying to find a cabinet maker to work with. So she actually introduced me to the cabinet maker that did the restoration for the dealer that she worked for. And so I came to New York to meet him and have it wasn't really an interview. It was more to talk with him, to get information about cabinet makers, because I wasn't really interested in restoration. I thought I wanted to actually design and build. But when I went into that shop, I was fascinated by the antiques that I saw there. I was fascinated by the work being done there. And the more that we talked, the more interested I got in the restoration. And he actually offered me an apprenticeship. So I moved to New York and became an apprentice in a restoration shop.
Very cool.
And yeah, it was perfect because I could use all of the skills I already knew from painting and doing sculptures.
Yeah, and what's your favorite, or do you have a favorite period for furniture?
I specialize, well, I do 17th, 18th furniture. I specialize most in 18th century furniture. I do some 19th century, but 18th century is really the period that I prefer. And interestingly enough, I'm known more for doing a lot of restoration on Oriental lacquer furniture, which is just because there's very few people that do that. So I guess I became more known for that. But I really prefer working on 18th century painted furniture.
Oh.
It's very challenging, but it's also very interesting.
And it ties you right back to your original training in painting.
Yes, yes. Mm-hmm.
Very cool. Going back to your teaching, you and Ramon are foremost experts in the world on the Spanish system. And you guys have had an opportunity to train people all over the world. What is the most memorable place for you that you've been able to travel to teach?
Well, I think I've liked every place we've ever gone to because we've always taken the opportunity to, to at least stay 2 or 3 days and do a little bit of touristing around. But in terms of actually teaching, I have to say one of the most interesting things was we went to Australia to teach for the Patty Cream, where we were in this place called Toowoomba for a week. And the interesting thing was that at the end of the week, so we were teaching all these people that are just trained in theater arts and stage combat. So at the end of the week, Ramon wanted them to actually try to fence, and none of these people had ever fenced before. So it was interesting because they all had to fence against me. And so they put on, masks and jackets. And there was this one gentleman who, it was so interesting because he must have been maybe 6'4", 6'5".
Big guy.
Very big guy. Could have been a cousin to Brad Waller. And I'm using that, to demonstrate how big he was. And we started to fence, and I hit him, and he screamed. And we stopped, and I took my mask off, and I said, "Are you all right?" And he said, "That was awesome."
He'd never been actually touched before, right?
Right. And so, so for me, that was a memorable experience because for him, that was also, very interesting. And that situation had never arisen before. And then after that, when he released all of that with the scream, he was actually able to go back and actually fence. And my job in that was to get them to do what they had learned. So I was only presenting them with the same, essentially the same techniques and material that had been covered. So that was very interesting and memorable in that way. one other thing that I found extremely memorable was we do these trips every 2 years where we take just our students to different places in Europe. And the reason for that is because it gives us the opportunity to train outside, and train outside in a way that is very different than we would here. But it also gives them an opportunity to be immersed in a different culture.
Yeah.
So we did go to Spain one year, and we took them to a bull ring where the master there gave us a quick lesson with a bull, and the bull is essentially the head with horns. It's not a real head, but the horns on these bales of hay. And so one of the students pushes it around, and you have to thrust the estoque into the top of the head, which is essentially a bale of hay. But that was super interesting, and interesting how they talk about the training. And one of the things that I found really interesting was that these are all young boys that are learning, and so they do their first. I think he said 14. It might be 15 years of age when they do the first real bullfight against a bull. And if they show any fear, they're not allowed to continue.
Wow.
Because then it would be dangerous for them. Right.
Yeah.
So I found that very interesting, and I found that very also informative for our students to really see and kind of get an idea of how in any art you have to really take it seriously. And that's very difficult for us in today's age, where we're really not doing this to prepare for a duel.
Yeah.
So, and a lot of people do it because they think it's going to be fun. And at the end, it is fun, and we have to accept that. But at the same time, we also have to present it in a way that they understand the serious nature of what we're doing.
Yeah, the martial culture, whatever they're training for, is so different than what we generally see these days, and the time requirements. I mean, nowadays, with websites, if a page doesn't load in 3.5 seconds, they generally tend to go to another website.
Right.
And so having the ability to see how young they would start them, which is so different than what we do here in the US, right? Or maybe other places, but this is definitely the martial thought is very different than the general thought.
Yeah, and there's a lot of misconceptions also about what you do with a sword. Most people think of it as it's a very interesting phenomenon to me that people think that you are a fighter, and I think to myself, I'm not a fighter. I don't want to fight. I'm a fencer. I fence. I use the sword optimally. Don't want to fight you. I want to use the art and science. Or they think that unless there's a lot of brutality, it's not real.
Yeah.
And that's not the case if you read these treatises, from 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th century. They're all essentially saying the same thing, that you have to train, you have to think of this seriously, that the foundation, the structure is important to everything that you do, that it has to look effortless because you are training your body to move in a very particular way. And that's a commonality that fencing has throughout its history. But somehow today that gets overlooked.
Movies have informed people that it's big dumb thugs swinging tire irons at each other.
Mm-hmm.
And I like to tell my guys, if it feels too easy to be right, it's probably right. Because if you have to work, you're doing it wrong.
Well, yeah, I mean, if you have to work that hard at it, imagine, you know, how tired you're going to be if you actually have to do it for real. You don't want to, you want to conserve as much as possible. And it's not what we do is not battle. We're not in a war where the tactics and the strategy and the choices you make would be very different.
And discussing movies, I get asked this a lot, and I wanted to pass the question on to you. What is your favorite movie that has fencing in it?
Let me see. It's not a good question. Because I don't have a favorite movie that has fencing in it. I think I'm probably the worst and most severe critic in that as soon as the fencing it comes on, and I lose all interest in the movie.
Okay.
I mean, we have a whole list that students ask for, you know, recommended. I really like the Mark of Zorro with Tyrone Power.
Mm-hmm.
I like that, but for me, what loses it for me is all of the things that go around it, rather than the actual exchange that's happening. So it's just not an interest for me. Like if I watch, for example, if I watch Conan the Barbarian, which I actually kind of like, I don't think of it, and I don't think of the sword fight as anything at all. It's just part of the movie, then I can enjoy the movie.
Okay.
But if I start to think of it as how would that sword be used? Would that actually be sword weigh like 10 pounds? It's ridiculous. So if I start to think that, then I can't enjoy the movie.
Yeah. Yeah, there's I know for me, and I think I've told you this, I'm sure Jared has, I collect bad sword fighting movies. I love bad sword fights in movies. I think they're the funniest thing I've seen. But actually finding good fencing is hard to do, or good sword fights. I know I've always enjoyed Basil Rathbone, Danny Kaye, those kinds of things. We met, I don't know if you remember this, but we met very briefly in Scotland back in 98, 99. I think you and Ramon were sitting in a car, and it was when you were there for Paddy Crean. And Paul introduced us. And it was very short, but one of the reason I bring it up is one of the things I like to ask people is, we've known each other for quite a while now, and what is something that you remember with some interaction that we have had in the past?
Well, I think for me, it's when we used to all get together in the green room when we used to go to ISMAC and just hang out there and talk and, you know, pick up weapons and do stuff. Just a group of us, and a lot of times Paul was there as well. I think for me, I always enjoyed that because it gave us an opportunity to do, you know, just to talk about fencing, to work on, to look at things and exchange ideas, and just to fool around.
Yeah.
Which I really enjoyed, and I really miss that we don't have that opportunity at Combat Con because it's set up very differently.
Yeah, those were always great times where it was us instructors and not having to worry about wording our conversation in such a way that other people could understand, but we could share our thoughts back and forth. That was fun.
Yeah.
I think for me, one of my favorite memories is getting to spend time with you and Ramon at your home for Jared's wedding.
Oh yeah,
Really enjoyed visiting you and spending
fun.
time there.
Well, you guys have to come out to New York again.
Definitely, definitely, and we have to figure out a way to get you out here to our coast as well. Set something up.
Yeah, that'd be fun.
So, Jeannette, thank you so much for spending time with me. It's such a pleasure to see you and talk to you, and I have so much respect for you as a fencer and just as a wonderful human being. So thank you for taking time to spend with me.
Oh, my pleasure, my pleasure. Always great to see you.
You as well. Take care. Have a wonderful day. Stay safe. And hopefully soon we'll be on the other side of this.
Yeah, hopefully soon. Okay.
Thank you so very much.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.
Bye now. That was really interesting, and I really enjoyed talking to you, Maestro. If you guys enjoyed this video, please hit the subscribe button below. Subscribe to our channel. There's lots of other interviews and instructional sword videos, and you can learn sword fighting yourself.